On Wednesday, the 25th of January, 2023, at 7 o'clock in the morning, officers from Cheshire Police gathered outside a modest family home on Copperfield Road in Poynton. The street was quiet, lined with identical semi-detached houses, the kind of neighborhood where children walked to school alone and neighbors knew each other's names. Inside number 47, 5 children were getting ready for the day. 2 adults were also awake, already anticipating what was about to happen. They had been living under months of suspicion. What the children didn't know, what none of the neighbors suspected, was that behind the walls of this ordinary home, a small but organized drugs operation had been running for nearly a year. The contrast was stark and deliberate. While homework was being checked and breakfast was being made, conversations about cash, quantities, and regular customers were also taking place. This was not a gang house. It was not a safe house or a stash location hidden in an industrial estate. It was a family home. And that, investigators would later argue, was precisely the point. This is a story about 3 women, 3 different years, and 3 different cities. Yet each case revealed the same uncomfortable truth, that Britain's cocaine supply lines were being run not from shadowy warehouses or abandoned buildings, but from living rooms, kitchens, and bedrooms, from spaces where children played and families gathered. The women involved were not career criminals. They had no prior convictions, no gang affiliations, no history of violence. But they were central to operations that supplied Class A drugs to hundreds of users across Manchester, Salford, and Cheshire. They kept phones ringing, records updated, and money flowing. They acted as secretaries, managers, and enforcers. And in doing so, they revealed a hidden architecture of organized crime that law enforcement had only recently begun to understand. Before we go deeper into these cases, subscribe if you love real crime documentaries that dig into the investigative process, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's return to that quiet street in Poynton, where police were about to pull back the curtain on a year-long operation. Copperfield Road sits on the edge of the Peak District, a residential street that could belong to any small English town. Modest homes, well-kept gardens, cars parked neatly along the curb. Among them, number 47 stood out to no one except the officers who had been monitoring it for months. It was the home of Chantel Jackson, 37 years old, her partner Joshua Harrison, 34, and 5 children. 4 of the children were Jacksons from a previous relationship. The 5th she shared with Harrison. To anyone passing by, it was a typical blended family, but to Cheshire Police it was something else entirely, the administrative center of a small-scale drugs supply network. Intelligence had been building since mid-2022. Officers had received reports that cocaine and cannabis were being sold from the address, not sporadically, but regularly, not by chance encounters, but through an organized system of phone orders, cash payments, and bank transfers. The investigation was careful and methodical. Surveillance teams watched the comings and goings. Phone data was requested and analyzed. Informants provided confirmation. By the time the warrant was issued, police had built a picture not just of what was happening inside the house, but of how it was structured. And at the center of that structure was Chantel Jackson. Jackson's role, as described by investigators, was almost clerical. She logged payments. She responded to messages from customers. She kept track of who owed money and who had paid. She confirmed amounts and arranged supply. In many ways, she functioned as a secretary for Harrison, who was considered the lead operator. Harrison already had a criminal record, 2 previous convictions for drug offenses. Convictions for battery, criminal damage, and common assault. He was known to police. Jackson, by contrast, had never been arrested. She had no prior involvement with the criminal justice system. She was a mother, a partner, a woman who had spent most of her adult life raising children and managing a household. But intelligence reports soon made clear that her involvement went far beyond passive support. Phone records, which would later be seized and analyzed in detail, showed Jackson in direct contact with drug users. She was not simply answering the phone and passing it to Harrison. She was negotiating prices, confirming deals, and providing bank details when customers couldn't pay in cash. She was, in the language of the prosecution, an active and essential participant in the conspiracy. Yet outwardly, life appeared entirely normal. In the evenings, Jackson and Harrison posted selfies on Facebook. They shared images of family dinners, holidays, children's birthdays. The social media profiles showed no hint of criminality. But behind the images, police believed drug dealing had become part of the household routine. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, conducted in the same rooms where children watched television and did their homework. By late January 2023, the intelligence was judged sufficient. A warrant was obtained. Officers prepared to enter the property, knowing they would not only be searching a suspected drugs premise, but also a home where 5 children were present. The operation required coordination with social services. Safeguarding protocols had to be in place. The raid was not just about seizing evidence, it was about dismantling a supply line that had been operating from within a family setting. On the morning of the 25th, officers moved in. The search began at 7 a.m., timed to coincide with the household's morning routine. The goal was to minimize disruption to the children while securing the evidence before it could be destroyed. What they found confirmed months of surveillance work. On a bedside table in the master bedroom, officers discovered cannabis weighing 14.4 grams, valued at between 110 and 150 pounds. Beside it were snap bags, small resealable pouches commonly used in street dealing. Traces of cocaine were identified on surfaces throughout the property. Forensic swabs taken from a kitchen counter, a bathroom sink, and a bedroom desk all tested positive for Class A substances. In addition, officers recovered steroids, broadening the scope of what was being handled within the house. But the drugs themselves were only part of the picture. What interested investigators more were the devices. 14 electronic devices were seized from rooms throughout the home. iPhones, Nokia handsets, older models tucked into drawers and cupboards. One phone was found hidden in an airing cupboard, another under a mattress. Some were switched off, others were still active, with unread messages and call logs intact. Each device represented a potential trail of evidence showing how the operation had been coordinated. The phones would later be subjected to detailed forensic analysis, revealing hundreds of text messages, call records, and app-based communications. Together, they painted a detailed picture of how Jackson and Harrison had run their supply line. The search also uncovered digital scales. Forensic examination confirmed traces of both cannabis and cocaine on the scales, indicating they had been used to weigh drugs for onward supply. This was not casual possession. The equipment, the packaging materials, the multiple phones, all of it pointed to an organized operation conducted from within the family home. Combined with the intelligence already gathered, officers now had the infrastructure of a case. They had physical evidence, electronic evidence, and a pattern of behavior that stretched back months. Joshua Harrison was arrested at the scene. He was taken into custody immediately and later charged with being concerned in the supply of Class A and Class B drugs. Chantel Jackson, however, was not detained that morning. Instead, she was invited to attend a voluntary interview several months later, in May 2023. The decision reflected the complexity of her situation. She was a mother of 5 children. Arresting her at the scene would have required immediate intervention by social services. By allowing her to attend voluntarily, police gave her time to make arrangements for the children while still ensuring her cooperation with the investigation. When Jackson was eventually interviewed, she gave no comment responses to every question. Harrison did the same. Both declined to provide any explanation for the evidence found in their home. But by that point, the evidence spoke for itself. The phones had been unlocked, the messages had been extracted, and what they revealed gave substance to everything the prosecution would later argue in court. The text exchanges showed Jackson in regular direct contact with drug users. In one message chain, a customer asked if she was still active, slang for whether she was still selling. Jackson replied with a simple offer, a deal for £30 in cash. The customer responded that he only had £20 available at that moment. Without hesitation, Jackson provided Joshua Harrison's bank account details, instructing the customer to transfer the remaining £10 electronically. The deal went ahead. The exchange demonstrated not only Jackson's involvement, but also the flexibility of the operation. Cash was preferred, but electronic payments were accepted when necessary. No sale was lost due to a lack of physical money. Other messages revealed the financial tracking Jackson maintained on Harrison's behalf. In one conversation, Harrison informed her that a customer named Dean had paid £120. Jackson replied by itemizing the payment, noting that it had been received in 3 separate installments, £60, £30 and £30. She then confirmed that £1,360 was now stored in the tin, a reference to a cash box kept somewhere in the house. The precision of her record-keeping was notable. She wasn't simply handling money, she was managing accounts, tracking debts and ensuring that every transaction was documented. Jackson also initiated contact with customers. In one message to a contact saved as Matt, she asked directly if he still wanted a deal. Other messages, presented later in court, showed her confirming availability, negotiating prices, and arranging times for collection or delivery. Taken together, the evidence showed that Jackson was not a passive bystander or a reluctant accomplice. She was an active participant in the day-to-day running of the supply line. She communicated with customers, managed finances, and ensured that the operation continued smoothly, even when Harrison was unavailable. The case against both defendants was comprehensive. The physical evidence, cannabis, cocaine traces, scales, packaging materials, established that drugs were being prepared and supplied from the property. The electronic evidence, 14 devices containing hundreds of incriminating messages, demonstrated the coordination and administration of the operation. And the financial evidence, cash stored in the home, bank transfers arranged through Jackson's messages, showed that this was a sustained, profit-driven enterprise. For the prosecution, it was a clear-cut case of conspiracy to supply Class A and Class B drugs. For the defense, however, the situation was more complicated. On the 26th of March 2024, the case came before Chester Crown Court. Both Joshua Harrison and Chantel Jackson entered guilty pleas to being concerned in the supply of Class A and Class B drugs. Harrison's sentencing was straightforward. At 34 years old, with a criminal record that included 2 prior drug convictions and multiple offenses involving violence, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. The judge described him as the driving force behind the operation, the person who had established the customer base and set the terms of the business. Jackson's sentencing, however, required more careful consideration. Judge Patrick Thompson described the situation as finely balanced. On one hand, Jackson's active involvement in drug trafficking was serious and sustained. She had communicated directly with users, arranged sales, and managed the financial side of the operation. The evidence showed she was essential to the conspiracy. On the other hand, her personal circumstances provided what the judge termed substantial mitigation. She was the primary caregiver for 5 children, 4 of whom were from a previous relationship. Sending her to prison would have a profound impact on those children, who would either be placed in care or forced to live with relatives. The defense argued that Jackson had been operating under pressure from Harrison, who had a history of violence and controlling behavior. The prosecution itself acknowledged that there were elements of domestic abuse in the relationship, though they stopped short of characterizing Jackson as a victim without agency. Jackson's defense counsel emphasized that she had been trying to keep Harrison happy, to avoid conflict, and to maintain stability in a household where violence was an ever-present possibility. They argued that her role, though significant, had been shaped by coercion and fear. The judge accepted these arguments in part. He noted that Jackson had no prior convictions, that she had shown remorse, and that the impact of custody on her children would be severe. He also noted, however, that her involvement had been deliberate and sustained. She had not been forced to send messages or manage accounts. She had chosen to participate, even if that choice had been made under difficult circumstances. In the end, Judge Thompson sentenced Chantel Jackson to 2 years in prison, suspended for 2 years. She was also ordered to complete 200 hours of unpaid work and 20 days of rehabilitative activity. The suspended sentence meant that Jackson would not go to prison unless she committed another offense within the next 2 years. She walked out of court that day, free to return to her children. Harrison, by contrast, was taken directly into custody to begin his 3-year sentence. The case was closed, but the questions it raised were not. How had an ordinary family home become the center of a drugs operation? How had a mother with no criminal history become an essential part of a conspiracy to supply Class A drugs? And were Jackson's actions the result of coercion, economic necessity, or something more complicated? These were questions that would be asked again, in different cities, in different cases, but with the same uncomfortable answers. While Chantel Jackson was walking free under a suspended sentence in Cheshire, another mother in Manchester was about to face a very different outcome. Her name was Katie Baldwin. She was 27 years old, a mother of 3 children aged 4, 8, and 10, and from the living room of her home in Cheetham Hill, she had spent nearly a year running a cocaine and heroin supply line known to users across Manchester as the Snickers line. Cheetham Hill had long been a focal point for drug activity in Greater Manchester. The area was known for street dealing, gang violence, and the rapid availability of Class A drugs. Users could call a number, place an order, and have heroin or cocaine delivered within minutes. The trade was efficient, organized, and deeply embedded in the community. For addicts, it was a lifeline. For law enforcement, it was a crisis. The violence associated with the trade had turned parts of Cheetham Hill into what officers described as no-go zones. Discarded needles littered alleyways, rival groups fought over territory, and behind it all were phone lines, anonymous numbers that connected users to dealers operating around the clock. The Snickers line was one of those numbers. It had been established by a man named Adhil Ashgar, Katie Baldwin's boyfriend. Ashgar was 29 years old and already well known to police. He had a reputation in Cheetham Hill as a reliable supplier, someone who could be counted on to deliver quality product on time. He had built up a network of regular customers, most of them long-term addicts who called the same number every day. The line was profitable, consistent, and well-organized. But in early 2017, Ashgar was arrested and subsequently jailed for offenses linked to supplying Class A drugs. His conviction threatened to dismantle everything he had built. That's when Katie Baldwin stepped in. She took over the line while Ashgar was in prison. Her role was straightforward: answer the phone, take orders, and dispatch street dealers to meet customers. She acted as the switchboard, the voice on the other end of the line that connected addicts to their supply. She didn't manufacture the drugs. She didn't transport them herself, at least not initially. But she kept the operation running. She ensured that Ashgar's customers had no reason to look elsewhere, and she made certain that his business survived his absence. Evidence later presented in court showed that Baldwin did more than just answer calls. On some occasions, she went out herself, delivering drugs to dealers who had run out of stock. Sometimes she drove. Other times, she cycled. The method didn't matter. What mattered was that the supply chain never broke. Dealers on the ground relied on her to keep them supplied. Users relied on her to ensure their orders were fulfilled. And Ashgar, sitting in a prison cell, relied on her to protect his investment. The picture that emerged from the investigation was of a young mother managing an illicit hotline on behalf of her incarcerated partner. She wasn't just covering for him temporarily. She was actively running the business, handling logistics, coordinating deliveries, and ensuring that money kept flowing. Police would later describe her role as managerial, a term that underscored the level of responsibility she had assumed. The Snickers line never went silent, and as the months passed, Baldwin became increasingly confident in her role. She was no longer just following instructions. She was making decisions, handling problems, and keeping the operation profitable. But while Baldwin was keeping the line alive, Greater Manchester Police were closing in. Operation Danube had been launched specifically to target the drug lines operating in Cheetham Hill. The investigation was long-running, methodical, and focused on gathering evidence that would stand up in court. Surveillance teams monitored key locations, phone data was analyzed, and most significantly, an undercover officer was deployed to infiltrate the supply network by posing as a customer. The officer, identified in court documents only as Jay, played the role convincingly. Between July 2017 and April 2018, Jay called the Snickers line 19 times. Each call followed the same pattern. Jay would place an order for heroin or cocaine. The voice on the other end, often Baldwin's, would confirm the order and provide a location for collection. A dealer identified by a code name would arrive within minutes. The exchange would take place in the open, on street corners, in car parks, in the doorways of closed shops. The drugs were handed over, payment was made, and Jay, acting as a satisfied customer, would leave. The undercover operation was meticulous. Each transaction was recorded. Each dealer was photographed. Each phone call was logged. The evidence built slowly, transaction by transaction, until investigators had a comprehensive picture of how the Snickers line operated. When Ashgar was released from prison in late 2017, the operation continued without interruption. Jay made 13 more calls to the same number. The service remained consistent. The dealers remained reliable. And the line under Baldwin's management remained profitable. One of the dealers dispatched by Baldwin was identified by the nickname Brandy. Brandy appeared multiple times in the undercover operation, delivering wraps of heroin and cocaine to Jay and other customers. The use of code names was common in the trade, a basic security measure designed to obscure identities and complicate police investigations. But the undercover operation rendered those precautions useless. Every dealer, every transaction, every phone call was documented. By the time police moved to make arrests, they had more than enough evidence to secure convictions. The scale of the operation was revealed when 11 suspects were detained as part of the wider investigation into Cheetham Hill's drug lines. Baldwin's home was searched on the day of her arrest. Officers found £2,661 in cash stored in various locations throughout the property. The money was seized as criminal property, evidence not only of Baldwin's involvement in the supply line, but also of the profits it had generated. The cash reinforced what the phone evidence had already shown, that Baldwin had been handling the financial side of the operation, collecting payments from dealers and managing the money on Ashgar's behalf. When the case came before Manchester Crown Court, the evidence was overwhelming. Baldwin entered guilty pleas to 2 charges, being concerned in the supply of Class A drugs and possession of criminal property. Adhil Ashgar was dealt with separately. He too was convicted for his role in establishing and directing the Snickers line. He was described by prosecutors as the leader, the person who had built the network and maintained control even while in custody. Ashgar was eventually sentenced to 5 years in prison. Baldwin's defense focused heavily on her personal circumstances and the context in which she had become involved. Her defense counsel argued that Baldwin had been drawn into the role by loyalty to her partner and by the economic pressures of raising 3 young children on her own. They emphasized that she had wanted a better life for her children, and that she now recognized how her involvement in the drug trade had put that future at risk. They argued that she had been naive, that she had not fully understood the seriousness of what she was doing, and that she had been manipulated by Ashgar into taking on a role she was not equipped to handle. The judge acknowledged these arguments, but made clear that Baldwin's crimes were serious. He noted that the Snickers line had fueled addiction across Manchester, that it had drawn violence into communities, and that it had contributed to the broader crisis of Class A drug use in the city. He underlined the corrosive impact of drug lines like Snickers, which operated with impunity, feeding addiction and destabilizing entire neighborhoods. Katie Baldwin was sentenced to 3 years in custody. She was taken from the courtroom directly to prison, leaving her 3 children in the care of relatives. The sentence was harsh, but it reflected the gravity of her involvement and the scale of the operation she had helped to sustain. Baldwin's case revealed something important about the structure of modern drug supply lines. These operations no longer relied solely on gang members or career criminals. They relied on ordinary people, mothers, partners, family members, who were willing to take on logistical roles in exchange for money, security, or simply the avoidance of conflict. Baldwin had no prior convictions. She had never been involved in organized crime, but she had been willing to run a supply line, to coordinate dealers, and to manage the financial side of a conspiracy that supplied heroin and cocaine to hundreds of addicts. Her involvement was not an anomaly. It was part of a pattern that law enforcement was only beginning to understand. While Katie Baldwin's downfall had exposed how a single phone line could sustain a cocaine and heroin network in Manchester, another young woman in Salford was about to reveal an even more troubling dimension of the trade. Her name was Jaime Lee Brooke Parkinson. She was 27 years old, a mother of young children, and the girlfriend of a man named Ashley Blackett, who was serving time in Forest Bank Prison. What made her case different was that the operation she ran was not independent. It was controlled day by day, instruction by instruction, from inside a prison cell. Forest Bank is a Category B men's prison in Salford. It holds over 1,000 inmates, many of them serving sentences for serious offences. Security is supposed to be tight. Visits are monitored. Communications are restricted. Yet despite these measures, illicit mobile phones routinely make their way inside. These phones, often small enough to be concealed easily, allow prisoners to maintain contact with the outside world. They can coordinate criminal activity, intimidate witnesses, and continue running their operations as if they were still free. Ashley Blackett, 32 years old and serving a sentence for drug-related offences, had access to just such a phone. The phone was a Zanko, a tiny device smaller than a credit card, designed specifically to evade detection in prisons. Through this phone, Blackett remained in constant contact with Jaime Lee Brooke Parkinson. The messages exchanged between them, later recovered by police, revealed the mechanics of a supply line being operated in real time from a prison cell. Blackett gave detailed instructions: how money should be moved between accounts, where collections should take place, how to use scales and equipment to prepare drugs for sale. He directed her not only on daily operations, but also on long-term strategy. He wanted to expand the business when he was released. He wanted to build what he called an empire. In one recovered exchange, Blackett told Brooke Parkinson that they would be building an empire together once he was out. Her response was confident, almost enthusiastic. "We'll smash it," she wrote. She wasn't just maintaining his operation. She was actively engaged in the idea of turning it into something larger. The messages showed a partnership, a shared vision, and a level of ambition that went beyond simply keeping things ticking over until Blackett's release. Brooke Parkinson was invested. She believed in the operation, and she was willing to take risks to make it succeed. Evidence also showed that Brooke Parkinson was promoting the drug line on social media. She used Snapchat and Instagram to advertise the business, posting coded messages that regular customers would understand. The use of social media was not unusual in the modern drug trade. Encrypted messaging apps like WhatsApp and Telegram had become standard tools for dealers, allowing them to communicate securely while reaching a wide customer base. But Brooke Parkinson's use of public platforms like Instagram added a new layer of visibility. She was advertising in the same digital spaces used for everyday life, blending criminality seamlessly into her online persona. The messages also revealed that Blackett continued to use drugs even while in prison. In one exchange, Brooke Parkinson asked if he had taken a slug, a slang term for consuming cocaine. Blackett responded with a photograph taken from inside his cell. It showed a line of white powder racked out on a flat surface, ready to be snorted. The image was casual, almost boastful. It demonstrated not only that Blackett had access to drugs in prison, but also that he felt confident enough to document and share that access. For investigators, the messages pulled back the curtain on how organized crime could thrive even when its supposed leader was behind bars. Through illicit phones smuggled into prison and a girlfriend on the outside, Blackett's business not only survived, it began preparing to grow. The lifestyle funded by the drug trade was also evident in the evidence recovered from Brooke Parkinson's devices. Images showed shopping bags piled high on her bed, filled with designer clothing. In one conversation with a friend, she was asked how much one delivery had cost. Her reply was casual: £3,380. On another occasion, Brooke Parkinson spent £500 on a pair of Valentino trainers for Blackett while he was still incarcerated. The trainers were meant to be worn upon his release, a gift that symbolized both her devotion and the profits the operation was generating. But the most striking images were not of trainers or dresses. Investigators found photographs of perfume boxes, luxury branded gift sets from Yves Saint Laurent and other high-end cosmetics companies. The boxes, however, were not filled with cosmetics. They were filled with cash. Bundles of £20 notes were stuffed into the packaging, hidden in plain sight. In one photograph, Brooke Parkinson captioned the image with casual pride, "My little stash box." The use of luxury packaging to conceal drug money was both practical and symbolic. It allowed cash to be transported or stored without attracting attention, and it reinforced the image of wealth and success that Brooke Parkinson and Blackett wanted to project. The financial side of the operation was further reinforced by screenshots of bank cards and account details stored on Brooke Parkinson's phone. These images showed that payments for drugs were being made not only in cash, but also through electronic transfers. The line was flexible, accommodating users who couldn't always bring cash in hand. The use of bank transfers allowed the operation to reach a wider customer base and reduce the risk associated with carrying large amounts of cash. It also made it easier to launder proceeds, moving money through legitimate accounts and obscuring its criminal origins. But Jamie Lee Brooke Parkinson was not acting alone. Her mother, Wendy Brooke, became directly involved in the operation, supplying cannabis to her own circle of contacts. Messages exchanged between mother and daughter showed not just casual conversation, but active participation in the drug trade. In one message, Jamie Lee instructed her mother to keep proper records, to note what had been sold and what stock remained. The partnership of mother and daughter blurred the line between family life and drug dealing in a way that prosecutors found particularly troubling. There were also discussions about Wendy Brooke's beautician business. In court, the Crown pointed to messages suggesting that Brooke Parkinson's partner, presumably Blackett, was putting money through the salon. Prosecutors argued that the salon could have been used as a front for laundering drug money, masking illicit profits beneath the appearance of legitimate income. The suggestion was never proven definitively, but the messages raised enough suspicion to be included in the case against Wendy Brooke. The use of legitimate businesses to launder drug money is a common tactic in organized crime, and the beautician salon fit the profile. Small, cash-based, difficult to audit. The wider network extended beyond family. Ashley Blackett relied on a close circle of trusted associates to carry out his instructions on the outside. His brother Wesley was identified as one of those involved, as was Christopher Taylor, described in court as Blackett's right-hand man. Together, they formed the structure beneath Blackett, ensuring his orders were carried out, collecting payments, and distributing drugs to street-level dealers. The messages also revealed an undercurrent of violence that ran through the operation. Beyond the logistics of cash and stock, Blackett gave orders about punishing those who fell into debt. References were made to damaging property, a tactic used to enforce payment and deter delays. The threat of violence was implicit in many of the messages, a reminder that the drug trade, even when run from a prison cell, was never far from intimidation and coercion. By mid-2020, investigators had gathered enough evidence to act. On the 16th of June 2020, police moved in. Brooke Parkinson was arrested at her home in Swinton. The search uncovered 14.37 grams of cocaine at 81% purity alongside 27 resealable bags, each containing traces of white powder. Officers also seized multiple devices, capturing the trail of messages that had tied her to Blackett's prison phone. Further arrests followed across the network. Wendy Brooke, 47 years old, was detained for her role in supplying cannabis and later admitted her part in the conspiracy. Blackett's brother Wesley and close associate Christopher Taylor were also named in the investigation, each identified in the communication threads that showed them working on Blackett's behalf. The police action was the culmination of months of surveillance and forensic analysis. Devices were examined, message logs cross-referenced, and cash flows traced. The raid confirmed what detectives had pieced together, that a prisoner was directing a supply line through his partner, extending it into her own family and trusted circle. The case demonstrated the challenges law enforcement faced in combating drug networks that operated across both physical and digital spaces, that spanned prison walls and family homes, and that relied on trusted relationships rather than traditional gang structures. The case came before Manchester Crown Court in July 2021. At its centre was Jamie Lee Brooke Parkinson, who admitted conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. She was sentenced to 3 years in custody. The judge made clear that her actions had gone beyond simply following instructions from her imprisoned partner. She had taken an active role in keeping the cocaine business running. She had promoted it on social media, managed its finances, and coordinated its expansion. Her involvement was deliberate, sustained, and motivated by profit. Wendy Brooke faced lesser charges. She admitted conspiracy to supply Class B drugs linked to the cannabis she had been selling within her own circle. For her, the court imposed a 12-month community order with 15 days of rehabilitation activity requirements and 100 hours of unpaid work. The sentence reflected her more limited role, but also acknowledged that she had knowingly participated in the conspiracy, drawn in by her daughter and by the financial incentives the trade offered. Ashley Blackett himself was still facing separate proceedings when Brooke Parkinson was sentenced. The prison-based evidence ultimately led to his later conviction in February 2023. He was sentenced to 12.5 years in custody, one of the longest sentences handed down in the investigation. His brother Wesley, who had been part of the outside network, received 5.5 years. Christopher Taylor was jailed for 7 years. Together, their sentences reflected the scale of the operation directed from within Forest Bank, and the serious view the court took of Blackett's continued criminality even while incarcerated. These 3 cases, Chantel Jackson in Poynton, Katie Baldwin in Cheetham Hill, and Jamie Lee Brooke Parkinson in Salford, reveal a pattern that law enforcement across the United Kingdom has only recently begun to fully understand. The modern drug trade no longer relies solely on gang members operating from street corners or organized crime groups controlling territory through violence. It relies increasingly on ordinary people, particularly women, who take on logistical and administrative roles within supply networks. These women are not gang members. They have no prior criminal records. They are mothers, partners, daughters. Yet they become essential to the operation of drug lines that supply cocaine and heroin to thousands of users. The reasons for their involvement are complex. In some cases, coercion and domestic abuse play a role. Chantel Jackson's defense argued that she had been pressured by Joshua Harrison, a man with a history of violence. Katie Baldwin's defense suggested she had been manipulated by Adil Ashgar, drawn into the trade by loyalty and economic need. Jamie Lee Brooke Parkinson's case was more ambiguous. While she was clearly following instructions from Ashley Blackett, the messages suggested a level of enthusiasm and ambition that went beyond simple compliance. She was not a victim. She was a willing participant, motivated by profit and by the promise of a future empire. But coercion and ambition are not the only factors. Economic pressure plays a significant role. Many of the women involved in these cases were raising children on limited incomes. The drug trade offered a way to earn money quickly, without the barriers of formal employment. It offered flexibility, allowing them to work from home to manage their own schedules and to care for their children while still generating income. The fact that the trade was illegal was, for many, a secondary consideration. The immediate need to pay bills, to provide for children, to maintain a household, took precedence over the long-term consequences of criminal involvement. The use of family homes as bases for drug supply also reflects broader changes in how the trade operates. In the past, drug dealing was highly visible. It took place on street corners, in parks, in abandoned buildings. Police could target these locations, disrupt the trade, and arrest dealers in the act. But the modern drug trade has moved indoors. It operates through phones, through encrypted apps, through bank transfers and social media. The physical act of dealing, the exchange of drugs for money, still happens, but the coordination, the administration, the financial management all take place in private spaces. Family homes in particular offer an ideal cover. They are unlikely to attract police attention. They provide a stable base for storing drugs and cash, and they allow the trade to blend seamlessly into everyday life. The cases also highlight the challenges law enforcement faces in investigating and prosecuting these operations. Traditional policing methods, street patrols, stop and search, visible surveillance, are less effective when the trade operates through digital communication and from within private homes. Police have had to adapt, investing in phone forensics, undercover operations, and long-term intelligence gathering. The investigations into Jackson, Baldwin, and Brooke Parkinson all relied heavily on electronic evidence. Phones were seized, messages were extracted, call logs were analyzed. Without this forensic work, the cases would have been impossible to prove. But even with convictions secured, the broader problem remains. The demand for cocaine and heroin in the United Kingdom has not diminished. Supply lines continue to operate, adapting to police tactics, finding new routes, recruiting new participants. For every Katie Baldwin sentenced to 3 years in prison, there are others ready to take her place. For every Chantel Jackson given a suspended sentence, there are other women in other homes being drawn into similar roles. The drug trade is resilient, adaptable, and deeply embedded in communities across the country. The legacy of these cases is not simply the sentences handed down or the convictions secured. It is the uncomfortable truth they reveal about how organized crime operates in modern Britain. It operates not from shadowy criminal networks, but from living rooms and kitchens. It recruits not hardened criminals, but ordinary people facing economic pressure, domestic coercion, or the promise of easy money. It uses the tools of everyday life, mobile phones, social media, bank accounts, to coordinate and sustain its operations. And it relies on the fact that family homes where children live and play are the last places anyone would think to look. The question these cases leave us with is not simply how to catch and convict those involved. It is how to prevent ordinary people from being drawn into the trade in the first place. It is how to address the economic pressures, the domestic abuse, and the lack of opportunities that make drug dealing seem like a viable option. And it is how to dismantle the infrastructure of supply lines that have become so embedded in communities that they operate almost invisibly, hidden behind the walls of homes that look exactly like every other house on the street.